Hello. So this is probably going up today, which is the second upload or whatever. Sorry if you don't like having two videos in your inbox in one day. I apologize. But I feel like this is something very important that we need to talk about right away before anything else happens. This is how to fix Saryn. This is going to be some solutions that I have come up with that will bring Saryn not to a point where she is broken or so OP, oh god why, or press 4 to win. She will simply be good. She will be on par. She will fill a role. She'll be standing next to Excalibur and Frost in a different way. She'll have a different role and function because she's a DPS. Frost is like an area tank, and Excalibur is a very balanced, more pointed offensive frame. So they're going to have different uses, but they should be at about the same usefulness level, albeit for maybe different things. So I have taken some ideas from a very talented person on the Reddit named Sinter, and I will pop up and we will read what he had to say, and then I will give my light tweaks on his suggestions, which were very well thought out and very, very good. And we will end up at a very cohesive way to use Saryn that A, fits her role, makes sense for her theme, and is useful into high level. So let's get started. First off, we're going to look at Sinter's suggestions, and I will read it out loud, and we will go over that. In the background here, we have Saryn's abilities as they stand, what they kind of do for a reference point. So, this is Sinter. He posted the Saryn Rework Redux, and that's wonderful. Thank you, Sinter. If you're watching this, hello. You have very, very, quite damn good opinions, and I enjoy them a lot. So I'm going to edit this, move this up just a bit to give you guys a little bit more text, and I'm going to move myself behind there so that you guys can read the whole thing along with me if you would like to. So I'm just going to read the changes to the abilities, and then basically that. If you want to read his beginning or the end, absolutely, but I'm just going to go through the abilities. So first we have Spore. Increase the number of spores back to 6, or make the number scale with power strength. Initial cast gains a small area of effect or becomes a cone cast to help maintain the pace and ease potential targeting issues. Enemies get stunned for a short duration when infected with new spores. Increase detonation damage slightly. I agree with all of this. Increasing the number of spores back to 6 I don't think makes much sense, but making it scale with power strength is very, very useful. It encourages you to build more strength and make yourself more powerful. That should come as no surprise. Everything else here is perfect. It's exactly what Saryn needs to make her one a setup. It's a setup, it's a light stun. You can do it on a small like cone in front of you, or have like a burst on the enemy initially to get a group of enemies in the middle, so you have more targets for your Toxic Lash, and things like that. Wonderful. It turns it into an ability that is a true setup. Molt. Give it a similar invulnerability window as Snow Globe. Already wonderful. Defensive abilities should have scaling abilities like this, though perhaps not as long. Makes sense. 2 to 3 seconds with a reduced amount of additional health based on damage taken. We still want it to die and explode. Absolutely, because the explosion is damage. But also want it to remain around long enough to cast Spore and actually take focus away from Saryn. Regenerative Molt should be native to the skill. Change the augment to detonate the previous Molt on recast. About the augment being changed to that, I think the augment should just be something besides that. Making it detonate the previous Molt it's kind of whatever, unless it's going to be a Miasma detonation, in which case, fine, fair and good. Having regenerative Molt into regular Molt not only makes sense, but it means that you're not wasting a slot on your absolutely necessary more tanky ability, and it's giving you even more incentive to use your Molt regularly to keep your health up because you have a large health pool. This just makes sense. This is required for a frame that is incentivized to go in near melee situations or use a lot of more close range abilities. Because Miasma has a relatively short range, you are going to want to be as close to these enemies that you want to die quickly as much as possible. Makes a perfect amount of sense. It's wonderful. I have no problems so far with anything suggested. Toxic Lash. Detonates one spore per hit, scaling the number detonated at a time with power strength, max of 3. Absolutely, totally acceptable, and is wonderful. Augment mod is terrible, but sadly I have no idea how to make it better. Now, that is a point where I do know how to make it better. So, we already have an example of how you can enhance the usability of a melee weapon. And the code already exists in the game to do a similar effect like this. And I'm talking about Excalibur's Exalted Blade. Now, just adding the wave portion of Exalted Blade on top of Toxic Lash would be absolutely overpowered and is totally unacceptable. So it needs to be relegated to an augment, and that makes a lot of sense. It's an augment that you would definitely want to use and would be a huge benefit, but this ability would not be unusable without it because of the bump up in the number of spores you would be detonating. That makes a lot of sense. But with this augment, it would be maybe 20, 30, 40, 50% like of your normal melee damage would go less distance than Excalibur's Exalted Blade 4, and then would be a slower projectile on top of that. So it would be more of being able to use it in longer hallways or fill an area with like these big waves that would like slowly roll through, and you could get this big setup on these enemies. That would be absolutely wonderful. It means that you could operate at a slightly longer range and get more of a setup before you come in with your Miasma. And I think that makes a lot of sense, just in terms of just regularly. And it means the augment gives you a light boost in your damage even further, and an augment needs to give you some stuff. It's not Exalted Blade because it's not really for that. It's more so for giving you the spore popping effect with more spread. That's what it would be used for in general. I think that would make that ability absolutely fine. Like, of course, makes sense. It's a good ability. Now, lastly, we have Miasma, and this is the point where I knew that this was a quality post. Make it a timed aura like Elemental Ward that deals a reasonable amount of constant damage over its duration, while under the effect of Miasma, bursting spores with Toxic Lash or inflicting toxin on viral status procs deals a considerable burst of damage. The idea here is that Saryn is apparently envisioned as a melee frame. Melee should be at least as powerful and rewarding as it is for other melee frames. I could not possibly agree with this more. This is absolutely exactly what Saryn needs. You need to be able to create this Miasma and then bring it with you around for a limited duration. Because you are incentivized to use duration with all of your abilities, Spore, Molt, Toxic Lash, and then Miasma with this build, you definitely want the duration, and you're not just getting a single burst out of it that is then suddenly a dot. The dot is following you, which makes a lot more sense. And then, whenever you're using the synergy between your abilities inside of this AoE, which makes it so you want to get closer naturally as a frame that is more melee-oriented, you're using your Spore, you're spreading it with this Toxic Lash ability, and every time you're spreading it and popping these, you're getting a good burst of damage. But there's one change I would make to this 4, and this is the change that makes it so that this is an end-game tier viable frame, which means that you can fight enemies with armor, period. Because even with all these changes, just regular, you can't fight high-level enemies. Now here are the examples of the reasons that these other reworked frames kind of get around armor, and they both do in 2 different ways completely. So for Frost, his Avalanche can tear armor off enemies percentage-based. It's maybe not the best, but you also get the crowd control that comes with Avalanche with it, and it's a pretty hefty reduction in armor, even given that. So it's totally acceptable. And it is a good ability, just in general. Along with the more defensive style of Frost as a whole, it makes sense that he doesn't have just a raw armor removal. Fine. Sorry. For Excalibur, you use your 4, or you don't use your 4, you use your 2 as a setup for finishers. Finishers are finishing damage which goes through armor. So that's how you deal with these super tough units at like the later end of the game, where you need to do a lot of damage right now. You either can work through it by combining the Radial Blind with your waves, which can work over time and gets less effective as you go on, or alternatively, you use your finishers and you get a large burst of damage that goes through armor that is very, very effective. Those are the ways that those two reworked frames recently get around armor. Valkyr and Excalibur share their way around armor in terms of it being a finisher, although they set it up a little bit differently, and Valkyr is more focused. And she received more of a tweak than a full rework, but that has been kind of a core thing with Valkyr as a whole recently. So the change to Miasma. You would simply, and this is not a big thing, and it's not giving you an advantage against other units that don't have armor, is while enemies are within your AoE, every dot that's happening, which would be a relatively low amount of damage in your like reasonably sized area, every time the dot rolls around, it's a guaranteed corrosive proc. Which means that if an enemy is near you, they're losing their armor, they're corroding. So let's turn our attention to what the skills say on Saryn. Take off the Santerre. Thank you, Santerre, for suggesting these things. It gave me a lot of insight into like the full package of what we could do. So this is what Miasma reads as in-game right now. Saryn pollutes the atmosphere with a lethally poisonous mist that corrodes, very important, all enemies in range. Deals additional damage to enemies under toxin and viral effects. Toxin and viral effects, that last part, could be interpreted as like the explosions of spores can combine with your toxic lash and doing things like that. But the way Miasma is worded, that is kind of the effect that we should be getting. This as a whole would bring Saryn together as a frame that is interesting to play as, where you want to be using 1, 2, 3, and 4, but is also useful at the end game. And because you're using your Miasma to erode armor, you actually don't need to change her damage values at all, because she instead of scaling harder and getting more and more damage herself, she's making enemies around her more and more vulnerable to her corrosive, like her poison and her corrosion. And that is like what she's doing. It's kind of the theme of the frame, is to be this like corroding, like moving mist that just eats away at the enemy ranks. It's not only interesting, but it would be very fun to play. And I think that like it would be in a lot of ways similar to Ember with her world on fire, but mechanically it would function in a much different way. And I think that would be just, that would fix Saryn. It incorporates a lot of the changes that have already been made to Saryn, which a lot of them mechanically work well. But then it takes it to the step further where we have like a cohesive frame that works itself into the meta in a place that makes sense. It's a frame that you could take and you could go and like solo T4 for an hour, and it would be like a normal thing that frame could do. You could go fight. It would be great. And it also makes your build make sense, where you're using a lot of duration, a lot of strength, but you're not really sacrificing like fleeting expertise. You don't just throw that into the build and then you're like, I'm fucked. You're still able to like sustain this. And the initial timer I would like to see on Miasma would be like 30 seconds. 20 to 30. I'll say 20 to 30. 30 maybe a little overkill, maybe 25. And then have its initial damage per second reduced to 100. Which may seem like, well, why are you nerfing Saryn? Well, it's not nerfing Saryn, because you're also at the same time adding those corrosive procs, which are giving her more reason. And because this is going to be a moving AoE that lasts much longer, you have to reduce the damage. And I think that just makes sense on the whole. But then also on top of that, we need to go a step further. Because Miasma correlates with your toxin and your viral, I think whenever you spore an enemy and then use your toxic lash on them, right now that gives you roughly 300% damage. And it gives them a guaranteed viral proc, so it halves their health. Yeah, it gives you roughly 3 times damage, and it halves their health because they're under a viral proc. That's pretty strong. And then combined with the burst, like the extra burst that you get from Miasma on Spores, that would be fine. So you don't need to have Miasma inherently doing more than just 100 a second. Obviously changeable by mods, but 200% strength is only going to get you to 200, and that's not OP or anything crazy like that at any reasonably leveled enemies. And if you're bringing that kind of build back to like level 10 areas, you should be expecting to be very powerful. But I'm going to wrap it up. Many of you probably don't want another 30-minute escapade into Saryn's ordeal currently, but that is how I would fix Saryn. Huge thanks to Sinter on the Reddits for giving me a little more insight into what a cohesive, well, the beginnings of a cohesive build for Saryn. I think this would be a huge step in the right direction, and would bring Saryn right around the area where Frost and Xcal are, and would make her fun to play. But let me know what you think in the comments. If you have any other suggestions, always remember that try and keep it balanced around the frames that we already have, that we know are being used and are very good. Frames like Ember, Frost, Xcal, let's see here. Ember, Frost, Xcal, Valkyr is in there, Mirage, frames like that. Try and keep them around that level. Don't be like, well, just buff it to 1,000,000 damage a second. That's not balance. But I would love to hear your suggestions on what you think of this fix to Saryn on the whole, and I'll see you tomorrow.